They laughed at the black woman in uniform. Big mistake. Yo, I think somebody's mama got lost on the way to the PX. Corporal Ryan Walker's shout cuts across the dusty training field at Fort Braxton. He nudges Private Matthew Collins, pointing at a black woman in gray athletic wear walking toward the obstacle course. Collins whips out his phone, already recording, his grin widening. "Ma'am, the food bank is in town, not on base," he yells, doubled over with laughter. Staff Sergeant Tyler Anderson, who should be supervising, leans against a Humvee, arms crossed, smirking. "Bet she's here looking for her baby daddy," he calls out. They aren't just mocking a civilian, they're filming a black woman approaching military training grounds, treating her like entertainment, performing for social media likes. The woman doesn't flinch. She reaches into her bag and produces a military ID, her expression carved from stone. "I'm here on official business." "Scan it." Collins waves it away like swatting a fly. "That's fake as hell. You probably got that printed at Kinko's." Walker zooms in on her face, narrating for his phone, "Y'all, we got a crazy lady with a bootleg ID trying to get on base. What these men don't realize is that they have just destroyed their careers in under 2 minutes. This woman is Lieutenant Colonel Aaliyah Johnson. 72 hours ago, she was at the Pentagon receiving orders from Major General Patricia Reeves. Fort Braxton has a problem, 6 months of dismissed harassment complaints from black personnel. Johnson isn't lost. She's here undercover to see what happens when the mask of rank is removed and true character is revealed." 72 hours before the confrontation at Fort Braxton, Lieutenant Colonel Aaliyah Johnson walked through the labyrinth of Pentagon corridors, her polished shoes clicking against marble floors that had witnessed decades of decisions that shaped nations. The building's magnitude never lost its weight, every turn reminded her that history wasn't made in battlefields alone, but in rooms like the one she was about to enter. The secure briefing room was windowless, sterile, designed for conversations that couldn't escape. Major General Patricia Reeves sat at the head of the table, a white woman whose silver hair and sharp eyes told the story of 3 decades navigating a system that hadn't always wanted her either. Reeves had earned her reputation not through accommodation but through an unyielding intolerance of intolerance. She slid a manila folder across the polished wood, the movement deliberate. "Fort Braxton," Reeves said, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. 6 months. 14 complaints from black personnel, harassment, hostile environment, racist language documented in writing and witness testimony. Every single one dismissed or buried before reaching command level. Johnson opened the folder. Names. Dates. Incidents that ranged from racial slurs to systematic exclusion from professional development opportunities. A pattern emerged quickly, complaints entered the system and died at the mid-level, killed by NCOs and junior officers who acted as gatekeepers of toxicity. "We need someone to go in without the shield of rank," Reeves continued, her fingers steepled. "See what happens when they don't know who they're talking to. You'll arrive as a civilian. No uniform. No insignia. Just a black woman trying to access a military installation. We need to see their true character when they think there are no consequences." Johnson didn't hesitate. "When do I leave?" Reeves studied her for a moment. "You understand what you're walking into. This won't be easy." "I know exactly what I'm walking into, ma'am." But even as Johnson accepted the mission with the cool professionalism that had defined her 22-year career, a memory clawed its way to the surface, one she tried to bury beneath protocols and procedures. 3 years ago, her younger brother Marcus sat across from her in a different room, his army uniform still crisp but his eyes hollow. He'd been a brilliant soldier, excelling in every metric that supposedly mattered. "They'll never let me be excellent enough to matter, Aaliyah," Marcus had said, his voice stripped of the enthusiasm that once defined him. "I'm tired of being invisible. Tired of working twice as hard for half the recognition. Tired of hearing jokes that aren't jokes and being told I'm too sensitive when I don't laugh." She tried to convince him to stay, to fight, to prove them wrong. But Marcus was done proving anything to people who had already decided his worth. "I need to leave before this place breaks something in me I can't get back," he told her. Johnson had watched her brother walk away from a career he'd loved, another casualty of a system that preached merit but practiced something far uglier. She'd felt helpless then, bound by rank and protocol, unable to challenge the invisible forces that had driven him out. This mission wasn't just professional. It was personal. For Marcus. For every soldier who'd been made to feel invisible. For every complaint that had been dismissed as oversensitivity or misunderstanding. Johnson stood, the folder tucked under her arm. "I'll document everything, ma'am. Every word, every action. They'll show us exactly who they are." Reeves nodded, a grim satisfaction in her expression. "That's what I'm counting on, Colonel. Sometimes the only way to expose rot is to remove the veneer and let everyone see what's underneath." The North Carolina sun beat down on the dusty training field, but Aaliyah Johnson's focus remained ice-cold as the confrontation escalated around her. She stood perfectly still, her phone positioned at waist level, capturing everything while the three soldiers performed for their own audience, oblivious to the evidence they were creating. "Official business?" Private Matthew Collins laughed so hard he had to bend over, hands on his knees. "What, did your Section 8 housing get denied? You come here thinking the Army gonna help you out?" Corporal Ryan Walker circled her slowly, his phone camera tracking her face like a predator studying prey. "Y'all, we got a crazy lady trying to get on base with a fake ID," he narrated, his voice pitched for maximum entertainment value. "This is wild. She really thought this was gonna work." Johnson attempted once more, her voice steady and professional. "I'm here on official Pentagon authorization. If you scan the ID properly, you'll see. Pentagon authorization." Collins slapped his thigh. "Did you hear that, Sarge? She said Pentagon." His mockery was performative, designed to entertain Walker's social media followers who would see this later, to rack up likes and shares and comments celebrating their heroic defense of military property. Staff Sergeant Tyler Anderson should have intervened 3 minutes ago. His rank, his position, his responsibility, all of it demanded that he stop this circus and actually verify Johnson's credentials properly. Instead, he pushed off from the Humvee he'd been leaning against and pulled his radio from his belt, his smirk never faltering. "Guard Shack, this is Anderson at the South Training Grounds," he said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who believed himself untouchable. "We need MPs down here. Got a trespasser refusing to leave, possible mental health crisis. Subject is agitated, making claims about Pentagon authorization, presenting what appears to be fraudulent identification." Johnson recognized the tactic immediately, the weaponization of mental health concerns to discredit and dismiss. It was a particularly insidious approach when used against black women, playing into centuries-old stereotypes about instability and irrationality. Frame her as mentally unwell, and suddenly her credentials don't matter, her words carry no weight, her very presence becomes evidence of disorder rather than official business. She didn't argue. Didn't raise her voice. Didn't give them the agitated subject they were trying to create for their narrative. Military training had taught her many things, but perhaps the most valuable was breath control, how to keep your heart rate steady when everything around you was chaos, how to maintain clarity when others were trying to strip you of dignity. Her phone continued recording, capturing Anderson's face in high definition as he stepped closer, his expression a mixture of condescension and something darker, satisfaction. He was enjoying this. "Ma'am," Anderson said, his tone dripping with false concern, "this is a military installation. I don't know what it is you think you're doing here, but whatever story you've convinced yourself of, it ends now. The MPs will be here in 2 minutes, and they'll escort you off base. If you're lucky, they'll just ban you from the property. If you resist, you'll be arrested." Collins had his phone positioned for the perfect angle, zooming in on Johnson's face, waiting for the breakdown, the anger, the explosive reaction that would justify everything they'd done and validate every assumption they'd made about who she was. Johnson met Anderson's eyes, her expression unreadable. "I understand, Sergeant. Thank you for calling the MPs. I'm happy to wait for them to arrive and properly scan my identification." Her composure seemed to frustrate them more than resistance would have. They'd expected tears or rage, something that would confirm their narrative. Instead, they got a woman who stood like she had every right to be exactly where she was, who spoke with the calm of someone who knew that truth had a way of revealing itself. In the distance, sirens approached. Walker grinned at his camera. "Here comes the cavalry, y'all. About to see this lady get escorted out." He turned the phone toward the approaching vehicles, their lights flashing red and blue against the afternoon sky. Johnson's finger remained steady on her phone's record button, capturing every second. She had 12 minutes of footage now. 12 minutes that would change everything. The two military police vehicles kicked up dust as they skidded to a halt, their lights painting the training grounds in alternating washes of red and blue. Corporal Davis stepped out first, a young black woman whose crisp uniform and precise movement spoke to someone who took her role seriously. Private First Class Martinez followed, his hand resting instinctively near his sidearm, standard protocol when responding to a reported trespasser. Tyler Anderson was already moving toward them, his posture shifting into the body language of a superior addressing subordinates, even though MPs technically operated outside the normal chain of command. "Thank God you're here," he said, his voice carrying relief mixed with righteous authority. "This woman has been harassing my soldiers for the past 15 minutes. She's claiming she's some kind of officer, refusing to leave when asked repeatedly." He thrust Johnson's military ID toward Corporal Davis like it was evidence at a crime scene. "Obviously fake. We asked her to leave peacefully, but she became combative, started making threats about Pentagon authorization and official investigations." Anderson's face arranged itself into an expression of patient concern. "I think she might be experiencing some kind of mental health episode. We tried to de-escalate, but she wouldn't listen to reason." Private Collins stepped forward, his phone now tucked away, his entire demeanor transformed into that of a concerned soldier who'd been victimized. "She got aggressive when we asked her to leave," he added, his voice earnest. "Started threatening us with stories about how she was going to have us all court-martialed. When we tried to explain she needed authorization to be here, she accused us of racism." The word hung in the air like a weapon they'd successfully defused. By saying it first, by framing it as her unreasonable accusation, they'd inoculated themselves against the reality of what they'd done. Johnson remained silent, standing exactly where she'd been for the past 12 minutes, her phone still recording at waist level. She watched the narrative being constructed around her, watched these men build the cage they expected her to be trapped in. Corporal Davis took the ID, her eyes flicking between Johnson and the three soldiers. Something in her expression shifted, a recognition, perhaps, of a familiar dynamic. She'd seen this before, maybe even experienced versions of it herself. The way a black woman's presence could be reframed as aggression, her credentials questioned, her very rationality called into doubt. "Ma'am," Davis said, her voice neutral but not unkind, "I need to ask you to remain where you are while we verify this identification." There was a question in her eyes that she couldn't voice. "Why aren't you defending yourself?" Johnson met her gaze and gave the smallest nod. "Trust the process. Let the truth emerge." Davis slid the ID into her scanner, a portable device linked directly to the Defense Department's personnel database. The machine beeped once, processing. Then beeped again, a different tone. Then a third beep, this one urgent, accompanied by a red flashing light on the scanner's display. Davis's eyes widened as she read the screen. She looked up at Johnson, then at the three soldiers, then back at the screen as if the text might have changed in that split second. "Sarge," she said to Martinez, her voice careful and controlled, "we have a situation here." Martinez stepped closer, reading over her shoulder. His face drained of color. The scanner's screen displayed a message in bold red text, "Security clearance level, top secret/SCI, rank, Lieutenant Colonel. Contact base command immediately." Do not detain. Do not delay. Tyler Anderson's confident posture crumbled slightly. What? That can't be right. Run it again. The ID is obviously. The ID is legitimate, Sergeant, Davis said, her voice now carrying a weight that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. She keyed her radio with shaking hands. Dispatch, this is Davis at South Training Grounds. I need the Provost Marshal, Chief of Staff, and Base Commander at this location immediately. Priority 1. We have a Lieutenant Colonel on scene who has been. She trailed off, seemingly unable to find words to describe what had just happened. Collins's phone, which he'd picked up from where he'd dropped it, slipped from his fingers again. Walker's face had gone from cocky entertainment to dawning horror. Anderson stood frozen, his mind clearly racing through the past 15 minutes, calculating the depth of the hole he'd just dug. Johnson finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. Corporal Davis, thank you for properly scanning my identification. I appreciate your professionalism. In the distance, more sirens approached. Command was 3 minutes away. The reckoning had begun. The next 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. Tyler Anderson's mouth opened and closed several times, words forming and dying before they could reach the air. Matthew Collins had picked up his phone from the dirt, staring at it like the device had betrayed him, as if the recording he'd been so proud of moments ago had transformed into a weapon pointed back at himself. Ryan Walker stood perfectly still, his face cycling through expressions, confusion, realization, denial, and finally, naked fear. Corporal Davis maintained her professional composure, but her eyes kept darting to Johnson with something like awe mixed with horror at what she'd just witnessed. Private First Class Martinez had taken 3 steps back from the 3 soldiers, physically distancing himself from what was about to unfold. The first vehicle to arrive was the Provost Marshal's, a black SUV with military police markings that announced authority before anyone even stepped out. Then came the Chief of Staff's sedan, followed immediately by a third vehicle, this one unmarked but clearly official. The doors opened in sequence, and Fort Braxton's leadership emerged like judgment itself taking physical form. Colonel Marcus Thornton, base commander, was a tall black man whose presence commanded attention without effort. His uniform bore the weight of 28 years of service, ribbons and insignia marking a career built on excellence and integrity. Behind him stepped a woman in civilian clothes, elegant, professional, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who wielded power without needing a uniform to prove it. Johnson recognized her immediately. Dr. Simone Baptiste, the Pentagon civilian liaison for high-level investigations, the woman whose presence meant this wasn't just a Fort Braxton problem anymore, this was institutional. Thornton's eyes swept the scene, taking in the positions, the dynamics, the way Corporal Davis stood protectively between Johnson and the 3 soldiers. He approached Johnson directly, his stride purposeful, and when he came to attention 3 feet in front of her, every person on that training ground understood that reality had just shifted on its axis. He saluted. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, Thornton said, his voice carrying across the field like a verdict. My sincere apologies for this incident. We were not expecting you until this afternoon. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Matthew Collins's phone slipped from his hand again, hitting the dirt with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Ryan Walker's face transitioned from confusion to horror in slow motion, every emotion playing out across his features as his brain caught up to the catastrophic reality he'd just created for himself. Tyler Anderson physically staggered backward, his hand reaching out to steady himself against nothing, finding only empty air. Johnson returned the salute with crisp precision, her movements textbook perfect. Colonel Thornton. Thank you for your prompt response. I believe we have much to discuss. She turned slowly to face the 3 soldiers, and her voice, when it came, was arctic, not loud, not emotional, but cold enough to freeze blood. Gentlemen, you've been most instructive. Every second of the last 12 minutes has been recorded and will be included in my official report to the Pentagon. Collins tried to speak, his voice barely rising above a whisper, each word dragged out through a throat that seemed to have forgotten how to form sound. "Ma'am. Colonel. I didn't, we thought." Johnson cut him off with surgical precision. "You thought I was nobody. That's precisely the problem." Dr. Baptiste stepped forward, her tablet already in hand, her pen moving as she took notes. "Colonel Johnson, Dr. Simone Baptiste, Pentagon Liaison. I arrived this morning to coordinate our investigation. I assume your undercover assessment has already provided significant data." 14 minutes of high-definition video and audio, Dr. Baptiste, Johnson replied. "From the initial contact to the present moment. Every word documented. Every action captured. Corporal Davis's scanner logs will show the timeline of how long it took before my identification was properly verified." Tyler Anderson finally found his voice, though it came out strangled, desperate. "Colonel, we didn't know. If you had just said, we would never have." "You would never have what, Sergeant?" Johnson's eyes locked onto his. "Treated me with basic human dignity. Refrained from racist mockery. Done your job as a non-commissioned officer and properly verified my credentials. Or do you mean you would never have revealed who you really are when you think no one important is watching?" Anderson had no answer. There was no answer. Colonel Thornton's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Staff Sergeant Anderson, Private Collins, Corporal Walker, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Report to the Provost Marshal's office. Do not return to your barracks. Do not speak to anyone about this incident. Do not access social media. The three of you are officially under investigation for violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Do you understand?" 3 barely audible responses, "Yes, sir." "Corporal Davis," Thornton continued, "I want your incident report on my desk in 1 hour. Include everything you witnessed, everything you heard, and the exact timeline of events from your arrival to this moment." "Yes, sir," Davis replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she just witnessed. As the MPs escorted the 3 soldiers away, Collins looked back once, his face the picture of a man watching his entire future dissolve. Walker walked with his head down, already mentally calculating the cost. Anderson moved like a man in shock, his 15-year career evaporating with each step. Johnson watched them go, her expression unreadable. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the grim certainty that comes from knowing that sometimes the only way to expose poison is to let it spread into the light where everyone can see it for what it truly is. The base conference room felt smaller than it should, the walls seeming to close in as the evidence played out on the large screen mounted at the front. Lieutenant Colonel Aaliyah Johnson sat at the long table, flanked by Colonel Thornton and Dr. Baptiste. Across from them sat Major Rebecca Chen, the base's staff judge advocate, her pen moving methodically across a legal pad as she documented every infraction she heard. Johnson had pulled the footage from her phone and from Collins's social media account. Yes, he'd actually posted it, before the MPs had confiscated his devices. The video now playing was Collins's version, complete with his caption, "Crazy lady tried to sneak on base today, face with tears of joy we wasn't having it. 100 points." The video had 47 shares in the 20 minutes between when he posted it and when it was taken down. 47 people had watched this and thought it was entertainment worthy of spreading. The room watched in silence as Walker's voice came through the speakers, "Ma'am, the food bank is in town, not on base." His laughter was sharp, performative, designed for maximum comedic effect. Then Anderson's voice, casual and cruel, "Bet she's here looking for her baby daddy." More laughter. Collins zooming in on Johnson's face, narrating, "Y'all, we got a crazy lady with a bootleg ID." Major Chen wrote continuously, her expression carved from stone. When Collins's voice said, "That's faker than your hair," Chen paused, looked up at the screen, then wrote something and underlined it twice. "That's Article 93, maltreatment of subordinates," Chen said quietly. "Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. And that's just from the first minute. Dr. Baptiste leaned forward. Colonel Johnson, your preliminary report mentioned that Staff Sergeant Anderson appeared in multiple previous complaints. Can you elaborate? Johnson pulled out a folder, the same one Major General Reeves had given her 72 hours ago, now expanded with additional research she'd conducted. Tyler Anderson has been the common denominator in 11 of the 14 dismissed complaints we've documented over the past 6 months. His name appears in every single case, either as the direct supervisor of the accused or as the person who filed the report dismissing the complaint as unfounded. She spread documents across the table. Private First Class Marcus Thompson filed a complaint 4 months ago about racial harassment from soldiers in his unit. The complaint went to Anderson. Anderson's report stated that he investigated thoroughly and found the complaint to be a misunderstanding of military humor. Thompson was then assigned to every undesirable duty roster for the next 2 months, night guard duty, latrine maintenance, KP duty during holidays. He requested a transfer 3 weeks ago. Another document. Specialist Jennifer Williams, a black woman, reported that soldiers in her unit were making comments about her hair and questioning whether it met military regulations, despite her being in perfect compliance. Anderson dismissed it as oversensitivity to normal grooming standards discussion. Williams was then given a negative counseling statement for failure to maintain professional appearance 2 days later. The counseling statement was later found to be completely baseless, but it's now in her permanent record. Johnson continued through the files, each one a story of a soldier who had tried to report harassment, only to have Anderson act as a firewall, ensuring the complaint died before it reached anyone who might actually care. But this is the most damning evidence, Johnson said, pulling out printed emails. These were obtained through the official investigation authorized by Major General Reeves. These are emails from Anderson to other NCOs in his network. She read from the first one, "If Jackson keeps complaining about every little thing, make his duty assignments difficult enough that he requests a transfer on his own. We don't need people who can't handle military culture." Another email, "The new diversity training is a waste of time. Just sit through it, nod when appropriate, and nothing changes when it's over. They can't force us to believe their agenda." A third, Davis filed another complaint. "I'll handle it the same way as the others. These people need to learn that playing the race card doesn't work here." Colonel Thornton's jaw clenched as he listened. 3 years, he said quietly. "He's been doing this for 3 years, and it never reached my desk. Not once." "Because he made sure it wouldn't," Dr. Baptiste replied. "He created a system where complaints entered and died. He weaponized his position as a gatekeeper, and every soldier who trusted the system to protect them learned that the system was rigged." Major Chen finished writing and looked up. "We have enough here for multiple charges against all 3 soldiers. But Anderson, he's facing something far more serious. This isn't just misconduct. This is systematic obstruction of justice, maltreatment, and dereliction of duty over a sustained period. He used his authority to protect harassers and punish victims." "How many careers?" Johnson asked quietly. "How many talented soldiers did we lose because of him? How many gave up on the military because they learned that complaints meant retaliation?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable but devastating. Colonel Thornton stood. "Major Chen, I want charges filed within 24 hours. All 3 soldiers are to be confined to barracks pending court-martial. And I want a full audit of every complaint filed at Fort Braxton over the past 3 years. Every single one. If there are more cases Anderson buried, I want them found." "Yes, sir," Chen replied. Johnson looked at the frozen image on the screen, her own face, captured in Collins's video, her expression calm despite the mockery surrounding her. She thought about her brother Marcus, about every soldier who'd walked away because the system had failed them. "Tomorrow," Thornton said, "I'm calling a mandatory formation. Every soldier on this base who isn't on active duty will be in the theater. And they're going to watch this video. All of it. They need to see what we're really fighting against." Johnson nodded. They need to understand that this isn't about 3 bad soldiers. It's about the culture that created them and the systems that protected them. Dr. Baptiste closed her tablet. And they need to know that accountability isn't theoretical anymore. It's real, it's here, and it has teeth. The evidence had spoken. Now came the reckoning. The base theater held 800 soldiers, and every seat was filled. Those who couldn't find seats stood along the walls, packed shoulder to shoulder. The mandatory formation had been called with only 4 hours' notice, and speculation had been running wild since the previous evening when word spread that 3 soldiers had been confined to barracks under investigation. Lieutenant Colonel Aaliyah Johnson stood backstage, listening to the murmur of 800 voices wondering what was about to happen. Colonel Thornton stood beside her, his expression grim. Some of them won't want to hear this, he said quietly. Some will be angry that we're even addressing it. Some will claim we're making too big a deal out of nothing. I know, Johnson replied. But silence is what got us here. Silence is what allowed Anderson to operate for 3 years without consequence. Thornton nodded and walked onto the stage. The theater went quiet immediately. When the base commander appears unannounced, soldiers pay attention. At ease, Thornton said, though no one had called the room to attention. What you're about to see and hear is difficult. Some of you will be uncomfortable. Some of you will be angry. But everyone in this room will watch, and everyone will understand why we're here. He paused, letting the weight settle. Yesterday, a Pentagon investigator arrived at Fort Braxton to conduct an undercover assessment of our base culture. She arrived in civilian clothes, without rank insignia, without the protection of position. She wanted to see what happens when the shield of authority is removed. 3 of your fellow soldiers showed her exactly who they are when they think no one important is watching. Thornton stepped aside, and Johnson walked onto the stage. The reaction was immediate, hundreds of eyes tracking her movement, some with curiosity, some with recognition of her rank, some with something harder to read. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Aaliyah Johnson, she said, her voice carrying easily in the acoustically designed space. Yesterday, I arrived at this base as you see me now, no rank insignia, no uniform, no protection of position. I wanted to see what happens when those protections are removed. I got my answer. She pressed play on the remote in her hand. The theater's screen came to life with Collins's video. The first few seconds were just the dusty training field, then Walker's voice, "Yo, I think somebody's mama got lost on the way to the PX." Laughter. Collins recording, narrating, "Ma'am, the food bank is in town, not on base." More laughter. Then Anderson's voice, clear and unmistakable, "Bet she's here looking for her baby daddy." The theater was utterly silent except for the recorded mockery playing through the speakers. Johnson watched the audience watching the screen. Some looked shocked. Some looked angry, though whether at the soldiers or at having to witness this, she couldn't tell. A few black soldiers in the audience had expressions that spoke to recognition, to having experienced variations of this themselves. The video continued. Collins dismissing her ID as fake, "That's faker than your hair." Anderson calling the MPs, "Possible mental health crisis, subject is agitated." The reframing of her presence, the construction of a narrative designed to discredit and dismiss. When the video ended, Johnson let the silence sit for a moment before speaking. 12 minutes, she said. From first contact to the arrival of military police. 12 minutes of documented harassment, mockery, and dereliction of duty. Private Matthew Collins, Corporal Ryan Walker, and Staff Sergeant Tyler Anderson have been charged with multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They will face courts-martial for their actions. She paused, scanning the room. But here's what I need you to understand, these 3 men didn't create this culture alone. They were shaped by it, emboldened by it, and protected by it. This investigation has revealed that Staff Sergeant Anderson systematically dismissed or buried 11 complaints of racial harassment over 3 years. Soldiers who trusted the system to protect them learned that the system was rigged. Some of those soldiers requested transfers. Some left the army entirely. A black specialist in the third row closed his eyes, his jaw tight. This investigation will determine how deep the rot goes, Johnson continued. How many other complaints were dismissed? How many other leaders turned a blind eye? How many other soldiers learned that dignity is conditional on rank and race rather than being the foundation of military honor? Her voice hardened. But let me be clear about something. The military I serve doesn't tolerate this. The military you deserve doesn't tolerate this. And starting today, this base will reflect the values written in our oath, not the biases comfortable in our silence. Colonel Thornton stepped forward. Every leader in this room, NCOs, junior officers, senior officers, will be evaluated not just on what you do, but on what you allow. If you witness harassment and say nothing, you're complicit. If you hear a racist joke and let it slide, you're enabling. If you receive a complaint and dismiss it without proper investigation, you're the problem. Johnson pulled up a final slide on the screen, a photo of her brother Marcus in his army uniform, smiling, proud, before the system had broken something in him that couldn't be repaired. "This is my brother," she said quietly. Private First Class Marcus Johnson. He left the army 3 years ago after enduring years of the kind of treatment you just witnessed on that video. He was an excellent soldier. He loved serving. But he learned that excellence doesn't matter when the system treats you as less than human. She looked directly at the audience. How many more like him do we lose? How many talented soldiers walk away because we fail them? How many times do we choose silence over dignity? The questions hung in the air, unanswerable but necessary. This base has a choice to make, Johnson finished. You have a choice to make. Will you be the person who speaks up when you witness injustice? Or will you be the person who makes videos of it for entertainment? She walked off the stage, leaving 800 soldiers sitting in silence, confronting truths that many had pretended didn't exist. Outside, Dr. Baptiste waited. How do you think they took it? Johnson looked back toward the theater. Some of them understood. Some of them needed to hear it. And some of them will never believe the problem exists. Then we'll focus on the ones who understand, Baptiste replied. And we'll make sure the system doesn't protect the ones who don't. The transformation had begun. 3 weeks later, the courtroom at Fort Braxton's legal center was packed. Military courts-martial were typically closed affairs, but Colonel Thornton had approved Dr. Baptiste's request to allow any personnel not on active duty to observe. The message was clear: accountability would be public. Private Matthew Collins sat at the defense table in his service uniform, his rank insignia notably absent. He'd been reduced to E1 as a pre-trial measure. His attorney, Captain Jeffrey Morris, had the look of a man trying to bail out a sinking ship with a coffee cup. Collins faced 3 charges: Article 89, disrespect toward a superior commissioned officer; Article 92, failure to obey order or regulation; and Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His own video had documented his crimes in high definition. Captain Morris stood for his opening statement, attempting the only defense available to him: ignorance and immaturity. Your Honor, members of the panel, Private Collins is 21 years old. He's a product of a rural community with limited exposure to diversity. He made a terrible mistake, but this was not malicious. He didn't understand the severity of his actions. He thought he was being funny, not realizing. Major Rebecca Chen, prosecuting, cut him off during cross-examination with the efficiency of a surgeon. Captain Morris claims his client didn't understand the severity. Let's examine that claim. She pulled up Collins's social media history on the courtroom screens. Twitter posts, Instagram shares, Facebook comments, all meticulously documented. Racist memes shared 37 times over the past year. Comments on videos using slurs that couldn't be repeated in court. A screenshot of a group chat with other soldiers from various bases where Collins had participated in a discussion rating which races belong in the military, giving black soldiers a 3 out of 10, with the comment, only good for loading supplies. This wasn't ignorance, Your Honor, Major Chen said, her voice sharp and clear. This was ideology. Private Collins didn't accidentally mock Lieutenant Colonel Johnson. He did exactly what his social media history shows he's been doing for years, expressing contempt for black people in uniform. The only difference yesterday was that he finally faced someone who could hold him accountable. Captain Morris tried to recover. Private Collins has expressed deep remorse. Private Collins expressed remorse after he learned Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's rank, Chen interrupted. Before that reveal, he was uploading the video to social media with laughing emojis. His remorse is not for his actions, it's for their consequences. The prosecution called witnesses throughout the day. Corporal Davis testified about arriving on scene and watching Collins lie to the MPs about Johnson being aggressive. Soldiers who had served with Collins testified about his pattern of racist comments toward black personnel in his unit. An expert witness analyzed the video, pointing out how Collins had deliberately framed shots to mock and dehumanize Johnson. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson herself took the stand for 2 hours, walking through the incident with clinical precision. She didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. The panel of officers deliberated for 47 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase was brief. Military justice moves faster than civilian courts, and the evidence was overwhelming. The panel returned with their sentence. 6 months confinement in the Regional Correctional Facility, reduction to E1, already accomplished, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a bad conduct discharge. Collins's mother, watching from the gallery, wept openly. His father sat stone-faced, his own military service, 30 years in the Marine Corps, making this moment particularly crushing. Collins stood to receive the sentence, his face drained of color. Your Honor, I just want to say. The military judge, Colonel Sarah Henderson, cut him off. Private Collins, you had opportunities to demonstrate character. You had opportunities to do the right thing. You chose entertainment over dignity, mockery over respect, and when confronted with authority you lied to law enforcement. This sentence reflects not just what you did, but who you chose to be. This court is adjourned. Johnson sat in the gallery, watching Collins being escorted out by MPs. She felt no satisfaction, just the grim necessity of consequence. 1 down. 2 to go. Captain Morris approached her as the courtroom emptied. Colonel Johnson, I want you to know, I don't defend what he did. I was just doing my job. I understand, Captain, Johnson replied. Everyone deserves representation. But not everyone deserves sympathy. Morris nodded and left. Dr. Baptiste appeared at Johnson's side. Walker's plea hearing is tomorrow. His attorney convinced him to cooperate in exchange for a lesser sentence. And Anderson? Anderson's trial starts in 2 days. He's fighting every charge. His attorney thinks they can argue he was just maintaining order. Johnson's expression hardened. Then we'll show them what maintaining order actually looks like when it's used to protect racism and punish victims. The accountability would continue. The system was finally working the way it should have all along. 2 days after Collins's sentencing, Staff Sergeant Tyler Anderson's court-martial began. Unlike Collins, who'd been a young fool documenting his own downfall, Anderson was a 15-year veteran who understood exactly how the system worked, and had spent 3 years manipulating it to protect harassers and punish those who dared complain. The charges against him were far more severe: Article 92, dereliction of duty; Article 93, maltreatment of subordinates; Article 107, false official statements; and Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Each charge carried potential prison time. Combined, they could destroy not just his career, but his entire future. Anderson's attorney, Major Richard Blackwell, was a skilled defense counsel who'd won seemingly unwinnable cases. His opening strategy was predictable but effective: frame Anderson as a leader trying to maintain unit cohesion in a military that had become too sensitive. Staff Sergeant Anderson dedicated 15 years to the Army, Blackwell argued. 15 years of service, multiple deployments, excellent performance reviews. When complaints came to him, he investigated them thoroughly. He found that most were personality conflicts being reframed as discrimination. He was maintaining unit cohesion, preventing minor disputes from escalating into division-destroying accusations. Major Chen's response was devastating in its simplicity. She called Private First Class Marcus Thompson to the stand, the same Thompson who'd filed a complaint 4 months ago about racial harassment. "Private Thompson, can you describe what happened when you filed your complaint?" Thompson, a young black soldier with barely 2 years in service, spoke carefully. "I was called racial slurs by soldiers in my unit. The N-word, specifically. I reported it to Staff Sergeant Anderson as required. He told me he'd investigate." "And did he investigate?" "He interviewed the soldiers I named. They denied it. He told me it was my word against theirs, and since there were no witnesses, there was nothing he could do. He filed a report saying the complaint was unfounded." "What happened after that?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "I was assigned to every bad duty for the next 2 months. Night guard duty in January. Latrine maintenance. KP duty during Christmas and New Year's. When I asked why, I was told it was just normal rotation, but no one else from my unit was getting these assignments." Chen pulled up duty rosters on the courtroom screens, highlighting Thompson's name appearing on every undesirable assignment while his peers, especially those he'd accused, remained on normal rotations. "Did you believe this was retaliation?" "Yes, ma'am. I believed I was being punished for filing the complaint." "What did you do?" "I requested a transfer. I was approved within a week." Thompson looked directly at Anderson. Staff Sergeant Anderson signed off on it immediately. "The fastest transfer approval I've ever seen in the Army." The testimony continued. Specialist Jennifer Williams took the stand, describing how her complaint about harassment led to a negative counseling statement in her permanent record. Sergeant David Chen testified about watching Anderson dismiss a complaint without interviewing any witnesses. A pattern emerged: complaints entered Anderson's office and died there, while complainants found their careers suddenly facing obstacles that hadn't existed before. But the most damning evidence came from Dr. Simone Baptiste. "Dr. Baptiste, can you explain the institutional impact of Staff Sergeant Anderson's actions?" Chen asked. Baptiste, who had interviewed dozens of soldiers at Fort Braxton over the past 3 weeks, spoke with clinical precision. "When a mid-level leader acts as a firewall against accountability, they don't just protect individual bad actors. They signal to an entire unit that the system is rigged. Soldiers learn that filing complaints means retaliation, not resolution. Talented personnel leave rather than endure abuse. And the soldiers who engage in harassment learn that they're untouchable as long as they have someone like Anderson protecting them." How many complaints did Anderson handle over 3 years? 14 documented complaints involving racial harassment. 11 of those complaints were dismissed as unfounded or personality conflicts. Of the 11 soldiers who filed those dismissed complaints, 8 requested transfers within 6 months. 2 left the Army entirely. 1 is currently fighting a negative counseling statement that appeared in their record 2 weeks after filing. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Anderson's defense rested on his claim that he was preventing overreactions, that he was trying to keep minor issues from destroying unit cohesion. Major Blackwell argued that Anderson genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. Major Chen's closing argument demolished that defense. Staff Sergeant Anderson sent emails obtained through official investigation, instructing other NCOs to make duty assignments difficult for soldiers who complained. He wrote that people who file discrimination complaints are playing the race card and need to learn it doesn't work here. This wasn't misguided leadership. This was deliberate, systematic obstruction of justice. The panel of officers, carefully selected to include diverse perspectives and extensive leadership experience, deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all charges. The sentencing hearing began immediately. The panel considered Anderson's 15 years of service, his deployments, his previous performance reviews. They also considered the breadth and deliberation of his misconduct. The sentence came down like a hammer: 18 months confinement, reduction to E1, dishonorable discharge, and forfeiture of all pay and benefits, including his pension. Anderson collapsed when he heard forfeiture of all benefits. 15 years of service, erased. The pension he'd been counting on to support his family, gone. His wife, sitting in the gallery, stood and walked out without looking back. Within a week, she would file for divorce. Johnson watched Anderson being helped to his feet by MPs, his face slack with shock. She thought about the 11 soldiers whose complaints he'd buried, the careers he'd damaged, the trust he'd destroyed. No satisfaction. Dr. Baptiste asked quietly. Just necessity, Johnson replied. This is what accountability looks like. It's not pleasant. It's not satisfying. But it's necessary. Major Chin approached them. The third soldier, Walker, accepted a plea agreement this morning. 8 months confinement, bad conduct discharge. He provided extensive testimony about Anderson's pattern of dismissing complaints. So it's done, Baptiste said. The prosecutions are done, Johnson corrected. The reform is just beginning. 6 months later, Lieutenant Colonel Aaliyah Johnson sat in a hearing room in the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C., facing the Senate Armed Services Committee. The room was designed to intimidate: high ceilings, dark wood paneling, senators elevated on a curved dais looking down at witnesses below. Johnson had testified before Congress twice before in her career, but never with stakes this high. Senator Patricia Murray, a white woman with steel-gray hair and a reputation for being unmoved by military spin, gavelled the hearing to order. This hearing of the Senate Armed Services Committee will examine oversight of military culture, specifically focusing on the Fort Braxton case and proposals for institutional reform. Colonel Johnson, thank you for your testimony today. Thank you, Senator, Johnson replied. For the next 2 hours, Johnson walked the committee through not just the incident at Fort Braxton, but the systemic failures that had enabled it. She presented data that Dr. Baptiste and her team had compiled over 6 months of investigation. Fort Braxton was not an outlier, Johnson testified. Across all branches of the U.S. military, discrimination complaints filed by Black, Hispanic, Asian, LGBTQ+, and female service members are dismissed or result in no action 64% of the time. When we isolate complaints where the complainant is Black and the accused is white, that rate rises to 78%. She let the numbers sit for a moment. This means that more than 3/4 of Black service members who file complaints against white service members will see no accountability, no justice, and often face retaliation for speaking up. Senator James Morrison, a former Marine and typically a defender of military institutions, leaned forward. Colonel, are you suggesting that the military has a systemic racism problem? I'm not suggesting it, Senator. I'm documenting it. The data is clear. The question is whether we have the courage to address it. Johnson presented her proposal, the Johnson Dignity Standard, a comprehensive reform package with 4 key components. First, all discrimination complaints must be investigated by personnel outside the chain of command where the incident occurred. No more Staff Sergeant Andersons acting as firewalls. Complaints go to independent investigators with no loyalty to the accused or the unit. Second, civilian oversight boards with Pentagon authority review cases where commands dismiss complaints. This creates accountability for military leaders who might be tempted to protect their own. Third, leaders who enable toxic cultures face career consequences, including loss of pension eligibility. If you spend 15 years protecting harassers and retaliating against victims, you don't get to retire with benefits. Your pension should reflect your entire record, not just your years of service. Fourth, mandatory, recurring dignity and inclusion training with teeth. Not 1-hour PowerPoint presentations that everyone forgets. Real training, with assessments and failure results in non-promotion. If you can't demonstrate a commitment to dignity and inclusion, you don't get to lead soldiers. Senator Morrison looked skeptical. Colonel, won't this create a system where false accusations destroy careers? Johnson met his eyes. Senator, the current system protects harassers and destroys the careers of victims. My proposal simply asks that we investigate complaints properly and hold people accountable for their actions. If that threatens your career, perhaps you shouldn't be in uniform. The hearing room went silent. Senator Murray smiled slightly. Colonel Johnson, some will say your proposals go too far. That they'll damage unit cohesion or create division. How do you respond? Senator, I spent 12 minutes being mocked by soldiers who thought I was nobody. I watched those soldiers file false reports with military police, claiming I was aggressive and mentally unstable. I documented a staff sergeant who spent 3 years systematically burying complaints and retaliating against victims. That is what damages unit cohesion. That is what creates division. My proposals simply ask that we enforce the values we claim to believe in. The committee voted 2 weeks later. The Johnson Dignity Standard passed with bipartisan support, a rarity in a polarized Congress. The reforms were implemented across all branches within a year. Johnson was promoted to full colonel and appointed Deputy Chief of Army Culture and Climate, a newly created position with authority to oversee implementation of the reforms across the entire Army. On the 1-year anniversary of the Fort Braxton incident, Johnson sat in her new office at the Pentagon, reviewing implementation reports from bases worldwide. A knock on her door interrupted her reading. Come in. Her assistant entered with an envelope. This came by courier, ma'am. Personal delivery. Johnson opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter on standard notebook paper. Colonel Johnson, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm 2nd Lieutenant Travis Williams. I was a cadet at West Point when the Fort Braxton incident happened. I'm black, and I was seriously considering not accepting my commission. I didn't want to serve in a system that would treat me the way those soldiers treated you. But then I watched your testimony before Congress. I watched you refuse to accept that dignity should be negotiable. I watched you fight not just for yourself, but for every service member who'd been made to feel invisible. Colonel Johnson, I stayed because of you. Because you proved they can't make us invisible anymore. I received my commission, and I'm currently stationed at Fort Hood, where I see the Johnson Standard being implemented. It's working. Things are changing. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your courage. Respectfully, 2 Lt. Travis Williams. Johnson read the letter twice, then carefully placed it in a frame on her wall, next to a photo of her brother Marcus in his old Army uniform. Another knock. This time, it was Marcus himself, visiting Washington for the first time in 3 years. He stood in the doorway, looking at her office with something like wonder. Aaliyah, he said quietly. I'm thinking about re-enlisting. Things are changing. Maybe there's room for me now. Johnson stood, crossing the room to her brother. She thought about all the soldiers like him who'd been driven out, all the talent lost, all the potential wasted because the system had failed them. She thought about the long road ahead. One case couldn't undo centuries of injustice, one reform couldn't fix everything broken. But accountability was no longer theoretical. Dignity was no longer negotiable. And soldiers like Travis Williams were choosing to stay and serve because they'd seen that the system could change. Johnson pulled Marcus into a hug that said everything words couldn't: grief for what he'd endured, hope for what might come, and determination that no other soldier would have to choose between their dignity and their service. There's room, she said simply. There's finally room. The military wasn't fixed. Decades of institutional racism couldn't be erased in a year. But the direction had changed. The accountability was real. And when soldiers like Aaliyah Johnson removed the mask of rank, they revealed not just who people were in their worst moments, but who the institution could be in its best. The work continued. The transformation was real. And somewhere at Fort Braxton, a young black private filed a complaint about harassment, and for the first time in that base's recent history, an independent investigator arrived within 48 hours to conduct a thorough, impartial investigation. The system was finally working the way it should have all along.